Welcome to the Natural Capital Podcast, produced as part of the Farm Advisory Service in association with the Scottish Government. My name's Harry Fisher, the host of the podcast, and over the course of this season, we'll be exploring topics related to Scottish natural capital, including what this means, its value to society and farmland, and the pressures and opportunities currently facing it. To do this, we speak to a wide range of people currently working and operating within this space, from farmers putting the work in on the ground, scientific institutes looking to put research into practice, and government and industry putting funding into actions that can make change. Today we are joined by Iain Boyd, environmental consultant at SAC Consulting, to talk about the newly published document by the Scottish Government, The Importance of Natural Capital to the Scottish Economy, a Regional Analysis. Hi Iain, how are you getting on?
Very good, Harry. I'd say thank you for having me on, but I usually sit in the background of this podcast and do the producing, so it's nice to be on the other side and see how it feels for the guests for once.
Yeah, it's good to have you over on the good side. We're talking today about this new report that the Scottish Government's put out, The Importance of Natural Capital on the Scottish Economy, a Regional Analysis. I'll just kind of give an overview of what this report is and why it's been written, and then maybe ask you to come in on your kind of key takeaway and some of the headline figures of it. But essentially, this new report looks to build on previous reports that have analysed the importance of natural capital and how this underpins our economy. So this highlights that in knowing this, we can better understand how losses in biodiversity and climate change might impact our economy and society in the future. The report specifically looks to go deeper, acknowledging that this will differ in location in Scotland. So to break this down, it looks at Scotland as Aberdeen City and Shire, Ayrshire, Edinburgh in the southeast, Forth Valley, Glasgow City, Highlands and Islands, south of Scotland, and the Tay cities. And it acknowledged that quantifying the economic impact of ecosystem services that are received from Scotland's natural capital can be quite challenging, and tying this to regional and national economies even more so. So to do this, the report looks to find what percentage of ecosystem services could theoretically be replaced by engineering solutions, and then estimates how much this costs. So Iain, what were the kind of main takeaways that you got from this and some of the headline figures?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting report. I think it's a really important thing to be talking about and looking at as well as part of like my day-to-day job. Environmental sustainability issues like this, they kind of come up all the time, but it's actually quite a complicated thing, and it's quite a hard thing sometimes to get your head around. So I think just highlighting really like why it's important and the impact that nature, biodiversity, natural capital has on the Scottish economy is really, really valuable. And some of the key headlines, I mean, they're pretty, it's big numbers and big figures that are being talked about. So some of the key headlines and key facts they say is at least 40 billion of Scotland's economic output is directly reliant on natural capital. So that's obviously an awful lot. It's about 14%, I think, of total economic output. And it's about 260,000 jobs in Scotland that it supports. So it's a big employer across industries like agriculture, fishing, forestry, water, whiskey, energy, all these sorts of things. Now, obviously, in our job, and we work a lot with agriculture and farming and food production, and that's obviously a sector that's incredibly dependent on these things. It's a very high reliance on ecosystem services, things like soil fertility, water regulation, pollinators, all these sorts of things. So, yeah, it's obviously a sector that is very reliant on nature, also has an impact on nature as well. So it's a really interesting place to work because for those reasons. I think putting a value on these things is really important because a lot of them, they are quite a hard thing to grasp. So putting an economic value on ecosystem services kind of makes it a bit easier to understand. But there's sometimes a bit of a risk people have with that, because then if you put a monetary value on something, it almost means like, well, you can compensate for it, or you can pay for it, or you can sell something if something goes wrong and you need to replace it. But I think this report makes it really clear, and it's one of the main headlines I have on the front page of it, is that nature is not only valuable, it's irreplaceable. So it also goes into quite a lot of detail, showing that only 27% of ecosystem services could be substituted by an engineering solution. So it shows you how crucial nature is, for these activities, and also shows sometimes we can have this desire or this want for some magic solution or a silver bullet or something that's going to come in and solve everything. But actually, what this is trying to highlight is it's really important to look after nature, look after our natural capital, invest in it and protect it, and because it benefits so much of our society and economy.
Hmm. Yeah, and kind of, I think it helps kind of reframe it. I think you're right enough. There's sometimes people don't like putting a number on nature. It's seen as something almost sacred, or something that we shouldn't be economically quantifying. But that doesn't mean that there's not some economic value tied to it. And I think acknowledging that and putting a number on it kind of opened my eyes as well, specifically some areas that how much of their economy is reliant on employment or economic output that is kind of directly tied to natural capital. And I think, yeah, it kind of reframes the way you look at nature and the natural assets that Scotland has and that we've built industries around as infrastructure to protect, rather than nature is something that's nice to look at. I think it does a good job of that as well. It kind of takes a case study of the whiskey industry. Would you be able to tell us a bit about that one, and just how the whiskey industry is maybe one that is particularly reliant on ecosystem services and natural capital?
Yeah, the whiskey one is a good example because it kind of pulls a lot of these different threads together and into something that is obviously a massive sector. For Scotland, it produces some great products that are known throughout the world. If you go into, always enjoy myself personally going into a bar anywhere in the world and seeing a bottle of Oban where I'm from is on the shelf is kind of a nice thing. But yeah, they did this case study of the whiskey industry and its reliance on ecosystem services, because obviously, like, when you talk about ecosystem services, it kind of they normally split them into things like provision, regulation, and cultural kind of aspects of it. So obviously, when you have whiskey, you've got the products that go into it in the first place, things like your barley, your peat, the water. That's a really important part of it. But then is also, like, when you talk about the regulation side of things, um, all these ecosystem services are helping us do things like prevent droughts and um, flood protection, ensuring the soil quality is right in the first place, which helps us to grow these kind of barley and everything that goes into it. So that's really important. But then whiskey's really good for, like, from a cultural point of view, because there's so much storytelling and so much kind of um, history and heritage that goes into whiskey as well, in terms of the sense of place, the whole tourism sector that it supports as well. So yeah, whiskey's a nice little um, snapshot, I guess, of showing why this is important, both culturally and economically, and how reliant really the sector is on nature. And obviously, a huge part of that as well is to do with farming and rural communities and land use, which it all helps to support as well.
Yeah, I think it's a nice example, just one that kind of ties into all of them, and it is, like you say, such a big export for Scotland, especially for more rural areas. It'll be a massive employer and source of economic output. One of the other like patterns that I noticed kind of across all the there's kind of three patterns I noticed across all of the different regions in Scotland. I wonder if we could kind of dive into them a bit more. The first being the kind of the dominance of the electrical sector and energy production. The report excludes oil and gas, and the economic output, as it were, from these, is because it does see these as inherently compromising other natural capital through climate change. So this is more looking into kind of renewable energy sources, and the fact that 84% of these are non-substitutable from engineering solutions, which I found a bit of a tough one to wrap my head around, because when you think about renewable energy production, it's kind of all engineering. It's engineering to capture this, but I think that's what it's getting at, is that you know a part of this, the energy production from renewables, will be the work that goes into creating the turbines, and or the solar panels, or the hydro dams. But the vast majority of what you're actually capturing and then what you're ultimately selling is natural processes. It is the wind, it's the sun, it's the water that flows. So it was a different way to think about it. Without these processes, there is no energy. And I think it's one to, you know, it's a hard one to wrap your head around as well, in regard to, well, how do you enhance the wind? But it is something that we need to consider when we're thinking about climate change and the shifts in weather patterns. How is this going to impact our kind of energy production, when it comes to wind, solar, and hydropower, and how do we ensure that this is resilient, because it is such a massive economic driver in so many of these regions. The other one was agriculture as well. I think this probably doesn't come as a massive shock, but just how massive an economic driver it is in more rural areas, specifically the Highlands and Islands in the south of Scotland. But we were kind of talking about this before. They show that 59% of this economic output is non-substitutable, which means the other 41% is substitutable by engineering processes. Ian, what do you read into that?
Yeah, I'm not sure of the exact. I mean, that people's definitions, I guess, of engineering might vary a bit, but you obviously have a lot of new technology, a lot of kind of advancements in certain things, such as vertical farming, for example. It's probably quite a obvious visual example of new technologies coming in, trying to change how we farm. At the moment, it's probably limited to certain types of crops. It's not providing the vast array of outputs and things we need. So I think that's probably part of it. Like looking after our land, looking after our soil is incredibly important from like a food security point of view. And I don't see that technology at any point in the future taking that away. That's always going to be important. That's always going to be fundamental. Technology has a big part to play in helping to kind of manage that and look after it and make sure we're getting really good yields and various things like that. But yeah, I think that's why if we take away from the technology side of thing a wee bit, but it's obviously part of it. I think that's where we're seeing this. There's a really big push for sustainable farming. There's a really big push for regenerative agriculture because it's something that we need to take seriously. We need to farm and do things in a way that works with nature and supports nature, because like you say, like we can't rely on something else coming along and helping us out in the future. We've got to look after what we've got at the moment. We've got to value it, and we've got to really try and protect it. I think there was another report which I can maybe bring this in because it is related, but there was a UK government report released a while ago, like earlier, like it was last year or maybe early this year. But it was looking at the kind of national security risk associated with global biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. It was actually a really important report and really kind of big kind of announcements for it. It probably should have got a bit more kind of coverage and a bit further up the news agenda maybe than it was. But it was kind of talking about, when we lose these really important ecosystems and biodiversity, even like someplace elsewhere in the world that is quite far away from here, that has all these knock-on effects and it has all these kind of implications for us in terms of like disrupting our food system, because we do import obviously a lot of our food. It can lead to water insecurity, can lead to kind of migration and kind of global geopolitical conflict and stuff. So food production generally, agriculture is all heavily dependent on how healthy our ecology is, how healthy our biodiversity is. And it's all incredibly interconnected. So it is vulnerable, to any of these shocks that come along. And yeah, there maybe is some sort of like technology fixes and things like that that can help prevent some of this vulnerability, and it's really good that these are being developed and things. But I think the main kind of point that this report and stuff is trying to underpin is that we're so reliant on our natural capital and the stuff we've got there that we really need to value it, and we need to really look after it, because yeah, parts of it maybe can be replicated and there's other things that come along, but the vast majority of it is irreplaceable. And yeah, we need to find sustainable ways to manage it and look after it while still having like a good quality of life, and like making sure we've got food security and low, good economies, and food's affordable and um, nourishing for everyone. That's really important.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I've seen that report, but I've not had a chance to give it a good read yet. But I think they're right enough. I think that 59% of agricultural output is reliant on natural capital. I think it does take in that a lot of the agricultural output that we have now is reliant on a lot of kind of engineering and human input, whether it be kind of synthetic fertilizers or irrigation systems, that's kind of propping yields up above what the kind of nature could, what the land could supply naturally. Um, but yeah, I wonder if kind of organic farming. I wonder if that, or regenerative farming. I wonder if that kind of number would kind of shift to more towards the 100% mark. I'm not sure. It doesn't kind of give too much more detail on that, but yeah, I think the kind of next thing that I wanted to talk about was the kind of regional analysis of this. So the report dives into each region in Scotland, kind of listed all the different regions at the start, but just to go over them again and give you a kind of the headline figures for each region in Scotland. So this is from highest to lowest, and essentially this is the natural capital related economic output for each region. So how much of the economic output is somewhat reliant on natural capital, and how many jobs this supports. So coming in at number one was Glasgow City with £10 billion, supporting 60,200 jobs. Then it was the Highlands and Islands, which was £8 billion, supporting 53,000 jobs. Then Edinburgh City in the southeast, that was £6 billion and 42,000 jobs. And then the Tay cities, £5 billion, 27,000 jobs. Aberdeenshire, £4 billion, 31,000 jobs. South of Scotland, £3 billion, 21,000 jobs. Ayrshire, £2 billion, 14,000 jobs. And the Forth Valley, £2 billion, 10,000 jobs. What do you make of that list?
I think it's a lot of pounds and a lot of jobs. Is the main takeaway.
I want you to now say it back to me.
Yeah, I'll try and remember all that. Well, we'll provide a link, won't we, to this report, because it is obviously 40 odd pages long if people want to go look in more detail at their actual region. But yeah, I do find it quite interesting. So in my head, if you look at it from the outside, things like the Highlands and Islands, to me, that makes quite a lot of sense, because you can see the natural capital there, and it's very easy to grasp. You can see the shorelines, the mountains, the renewables, the agricultural fields, everything like that. And what I found quite interesting generally was that places like Glasgow and Edinburgh, they were second and third. I think as part of the analysis, the reason for that is because maybe the natural capital flows there, they're a bit more hidden, but it's where like a lot of the headquarters of a lot of these companies, and therefore a lot of the jobs are kind of based and reliant on it. So I found that just quite interesting. But yeah, there's obviously one of the main takeaways, which I found interesting from, I think almost every region had agriculture and food production is kind of like one of the main economic factors that was most reliant on it, which obviously makes a lot of sense, and is why we're talking about it here. I found that I think is quite interesting also, especially the regions that when they're putting like there's an awful lot of reliance on it. I think it's quite a strong resilience, quite a powerful message on like being resilient to these changes, especially when it's such a big economic contribution and quite a large employer. if it degrades, it's going to be these rural economies and things where it's a bigger proportion of it. That's where, they're going to feel it first and hardest when you start to lose a lot of these ecosystems and therefore have these knock on effects.
Definitely, yeah. I kind of looked at it because they gave, as part of the kind of analysis they give, the total natural capital related economic output for these areas compared to the area's total economic output. So wanted to see how much of the natural capital economic output was as a percentage of the total economic output, and it's quite stark when you kind of you do that. The kind of order of the areas changes. I mean, Highlands and Islands moves from second to first, with 32% of their economy being related to natural capital related outputs and 21% of the jobs. And the south of Scotland moves from being kind of third bottom to second, because 27% of the economic output for this region is kind of directly related to natural capital resources, and 20% of the jobs are related to economic outputs from natural capital, which I think is kind of quite eye opening. And similarly, Glasgow City and Edinburgh moved to the bottom of the list because these places, the total amount of economic output that they provide, related to natural capital, is quite high, but that's because these areas have a high economic output. These are the kind of the hubs of Scotland. There's a lot of other industries, so the natural capital slice of the pie is actually quite low in proportion, um, which I think's, yeah, kind of echoes what you were just saying there. That it shows you, 32% of the Highland Islands economy is kind of directly related to natural capital outputs. That's huge, and 21% of jobs. That's one in five people who have a job that is related to some kind of natural capital economy. It just shows you how kind of you know how important resilience is to ensure that these are enhanced. Don't you think?
Yeah, and I think also when we're talking about these threats and risks as well, like these aren't actually future things. We are seeing examples of this happening. Whether it's pollinator decline, um, things like reduced yields, more inputs needed, the things that we're in a biodiversity crisis, we've got a climate crisis. All these things, like you know, they are happening here, and there's this kind of almost like an economic feedback loop. As costs go up, trying to combat some of these things. But yeah, I think trying to find ways to make us more shockproof and more resilient is so important, and especially like these numbers. That's the whole point of this report. It's just to kind of re-emphasize that, like, it's so important to try and do that. And that's why, that's why we were saying, like, that's why we've mentioned regenerative agriculture. That's why we've mentioned like sustainable farming and kind of new technologies and stuff. That's why all these things are happening. That's why policies and funding and all these things are looking into these things. It's this awareness that, yeah, we have to do something about it. We have to actually be proactive here. We have to value it. We have to really look after it, because we are if we don't do that, if we ignore it, it's going to cause these massive problems in terms of productivity and then economic decline and a lot of potentially bad stuff. But on the flip of it, having this awareness of the value of it, having an awareness of what the potential solutions could be, and doing something about it provides like a whole bunch of opportunities. And don't want to be, I think sometimes, when we were talking about all these environmental things and climate change and stuff like that, it's a tendency to be quite negative. But actually, the way I view it, and it's why I work in this area, is actually there's a lot of opportunities here. We have the ability to do something about it, and that will generate a whole bunch of positive outcomes. So that's kind of what we need to be doing, really.
Yeah, totally. I think the same. I think there's maybe at times, the kind of the the push for more kind of environmental consideration. It's maybe wondered if this is coming from a place of almost do-goodism, and kind of a moral standpoint. But I think maybe that's how it started, but that's not where it's kind of ended up. I think the more research that we do into, and evidence like this of how we are reliant on nature and what it provides, I think kind of just puts another kind of string in the bow of this isn't just a case of, protecting for protection's sake. It's there's science there to back it up. It's the need for better understanding of how we rely on these things so that we can better protect and enhance them, not for the sake of their own good, but for the sake of these kind of rural areas that are, 30% of the economy is made up on the economic output that they derive from nature. That's not include they kind of include tourism as a kind of a separate entity as well, and that makes, I think it was 1.4 billion in the likes of the Highlands, just from kind of nature-based tourism, and how much this contributes to the economy there. And I think it's why, in the likes of the south of Scotland, there is more consideration being given to natural capital. We've got the Natural Capital Innovation Zone in the south of Scotland. They're coming onto the podcast next month, so keep an ear out for that one. But I think this is derived from a place of understanding. These figures back that up. This is an area that is, heavily reliant on, the societies and the jobs and the economy is heavily reliant on the natural capital within this area. We need a better understanding of how and where this is the case, and more kind of funding, and innovation, so we can build that natural capital, so we can get, greater jobs and better paying jobs and better kind of work-life balances for the people in these areas. So yeah, we're going to have them on the podcast next month. That's a shameless plug, but keep an ear out for that one.
Yeah, it's like, any successful business, like for their long-term sustainability, they invest in their assets. And if you view it like that, like, our natural capital, our environment, our biodiversity is our most vital asset. So putting investment into it and is so important, and that's why you're seeing the government. That's why you're seeing public money, private money, all these kind of drivers and stuff happening at it, because that it's trying to support like this, all this stuff which underpins our rural economy, our farms, our wider economy. So you need to invest in it. We need to protect it. We need to do measures and stuff that helps to reinforce it and prevent any of these shocks and potentially long-term negative consequences. So that is exactly what you're starting to, what we are seeing. You are seeing all these different groups come together and trying different things to do exactly that. So yeah, it'll be interesting to speak to those guys and see what they say.
I think it's like you say, it is like an exciting time. It's, at least this is now recognised, and we're at the stage where we're trying to get a better understanding of how and where we're reliant on it. And there is such a promotion for innovation. I think that it'll be really exciting to speak to them and hear what kind of projects people are kind of getting money to kickstart, projects that build natural capital so that they can have greater economic output in these areas and improve the livelihoods of these rural communities. Is going to be an interesting one. You kind of touched on it there, but yeah, what do you think the value of this report is? Why do you think this? You kind of touched on the kind of reframing, but would you be able just to kind of go in a wee bit more about why you think, reports like this are valuable?
Yeah, I think a part of it is awareness raising. Now, it does build on previous reports. There's countless reports and articles and various things out there, but I think it's really important to keep these things current, keep assessing them, keep looking at it, because if we don't value it, you're going to start having diminishing returns, which you maybe see in certain areas and that. But I think a big part to me of this report is highlighting, like, the value of it and also the risk we have of not valuing it. And it's really important to just emphasize, like, make people aware of a lot of stuff. Natural capital, like, is a buzzword. It's a phrase that's used all the time, but actually thinking, what does that mean? What's all the different processes and components of it? And breaking that down is actually, it can be quite a challenging thing at times to do it. And this is, I think, when you put it in quite clear, like, graphics and quite clear words as it's done, in terms of, like, this is what it is, this is why we should value it, this is all the ecosystem services it provides, this is the amount of jobs and economy, and these are the sectors that really underpins and supports, and why is actually not substitutable. A lot of it, we have to really look after what we've got here already, and stop trying to come up with some alternative thing that might come along in the future. Actually, what we've got right now is what's important, and is already providing all these jobs and all this boost to the economy. And so actually, like, emphasizing these points, some of it is quite often like behind the scenes and invisible, but looking after it, investing in it, and kind of making sure that doing that doesn't lead to any risks and problems in the future.
No, I think you're spot on, and I think it's important that we restore and enhance natural capital to ensure that you can sustain the pages of notes that you're flickering through at the moment.
Actually, yeah, I really struggle to read stuff sometimes, especially when it's quite a detailed report, I guess. So I did print it off. So yeah, I am flicking through, trying to find useful nuggets in it as we talk. So yeah,
You're supporting that economic output there.
I'm helping.
Doing your bit. No, I think you're spot on. I think it was an interesting report for me. Framing it almost like if we had some other kind of infrastructure in this country that provided £40 billion worth of economic output and 260,000 jobs that we couldn't replace with some kind of engineering, let's start thinking about that like it is. This is something that we need to kind of take it seriously and give it the respect it deserves. Caring for nature isn't do-goodism. It needs more kind of understanding of what it does for us, and how it sustains these kind of rural areas, and how we can support people in rural areas to continue enhancing it and improving the kind of the economic output of these places, and the jobs that the people are working, and the kind of the money that they get for that.
I think especially, on that point, like when we framed it in terms of like the global issue, like the global biodiversity loss being framed as like a national security threat to us, and the impact it's going to have on food and security and all these sorts of things. But this natural capital we have here in Scotland is on our doorstep, and it's stuff that we can influence and look after for here and now. And I think that'll become even more important, when you have all these other things that they're highlighting going on elsewhere in the world, and it's going to have these knock-on impacts. Actually really valuing the stuff we have here that's right outside our window, and we can look after and we can do something about it. It's going to become even more essential and crucial over the next few decades.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. No, thank you very much for that, Ian, today. I think that was really interesting. We'll provide a link to this report in the show notes, and that other report that you were talking about the kind of the vulnerability of kind of biodiversity collapse, and how this is something that we need to recognise and solve the problem for. But no, thank you very much.
Not very light reading, but it's interesting reading, and it's really important documents.
No, maybe not one I'd read to the kids before bed, but definitely an important one for sure. Cheers for coming on today, Ian. That was really interesting.
Thanks, Harry. See you soon.
Thank you for joining us in this episode of Natural Capital. If you want to find out more on everything we have discussed, including the papers we were talking about, you can find links in our show notes, and more information is available on the Farm Advisory Service website. You can listen to all previous episodes from the Natural Capital podcast and all other series produced for Fast Sounds on any podcast provider or wherever you're listening to this one. You can access a wide variety of other resources on the Fast Sounds page on the Farm Advisory Service website. I've been your host, Harry Fisher. The guest was Iain Boyd, producer Kerry Hammond, and our editor Kieran Sim. This Natural Capital podcast is produced for Fast Sounds as part of the Farm Advisory Service in association with the Scottish Government.
The Farm Advisory Service podcast. Audio advice on livestock, crops and soils, environment, rural business, and more. Brought to you in association with the Scottish Government.